Normal types used to be among the very best in the game. Some even argued that they were better than the psychic types that were also dominant at the apex of Pokemon. However, somewhere down the line, normal types ceased to be the prominent, defining feature of the competitive scene, at least as far as standard play is concerned. Normals are still used, of course, but they are seen as lower tier Pokemon, and have been for a long time. Let's find out how the normal type was ruined, going through each generation, starting with the one that started it all, Gen 1. The metagame of the first generation can be summed up as normals and psychics the video game, at least at a glance. Obviously, there are exceptions, most notably in the tier Zapdos Rhydon dynamic, and there were others like Cloyster and Gengar, but the vast majority of the limited number of viable Pokemon in the tier are normal or psychic. Sadly, Girafarig did not exist yet, and so we didn't have a Pokemon that was both. As strong as the psychics were thanks to the great Pokemon they were blessed with in conjunction with the lunatic levels of brokenness that their type had, it was actually the trio of normal types that made up the most elite faction of the tier, the part that was most mandatory. Dropping Tier King Tauros was tantamount to throwing, but dropping either of the other two members of the big three, Snorlax and Chansey, wasn't far behind. You had to have a really good reason to do so, and it was incredibly rare for this to be the case, because normals beat just about everything, with your best option for handling them usually being a normal of your own, whether it was through the various entanglements of Tauros, Snorlax, and Chansey, be it against each other. Snorlax's great physical bulk in the maxed out Gen 1 made it one of the best Tauros checks, while Chansey was often used to slow Snorlax down, or mirror matchups, where Snorlax often checking other Snorlax, with Chansey stalemating itself, and of course, the most toutedly frightening iconic emblem of Gen 1, the Tauros mirror. Once you finish admiring how the Gen 1 player base lived through their own version of Apocalypse Now on a regular basis, you might realize this dynamic sounds familiar, and it is indeed because this is extraordinarily similar to how Psychics function in Gen 1. Now, of course, you can't just have your own Psychics crash into other Psychics. You know what non-psychic Pokemon you should use against Psychics? You guessed it, the normals. But before we go to the next section, here's a word from our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. Now, why would this come in handy? Well, with streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked. For example, if I were to vacation in Japan, where there are no subtitles on my anime, I could use Surfshark and change my VPN back to the US or vice versa, and now I have American Netflix wherever I go. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has 3,200 plus servers in over 100 countries. You supercharge any streaming service you have by doing this. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices, and there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe for 4 extra months of Surfshark. And thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Chansey's titanic special bulk and reliable recovery effectively makes it a psychic resistant, even in the face of a special drop, while Snorlax and Tauros have to be more careful about taking hits, but their powerful physical attacks threaten massive damage to the psychics in ways few other Pokemon can. This part may especially seem like a quaint relic from another millennium, and that's because it is. I mean, what an idea. Threatening normal stab? How does that even work? It doesn't even hit anything super effectively. Yes, but you know what else? It's also very difficult to resist normal, and anyone who's ever spammed the big choice attacker knows that in most instances, all you really need are those neutral hits. After all, in Gens 4 and 5, Choice Spec's Dracometer was almost never landing a super effective hit, but it was still the scariest attack around because of how many bulky neutral targets it threatened to delete. Now, one-hit KOs generally aren't something you see too much in Gen 1, given how everything has its EVs maxed out, and thus you see things like Starmie being able to survive a Zapdos Thunderbolt, but Gen 1 did have its own equivalents of Spec's Meteor, Choice Span Close Combat, or whatever you prefer, and they were indeed normal normal type. Body Slam might seem like a strange comparison, given how its power doesn't even come close, but then you remember it's also dishing out a paralysis 30% of the time, and you go, oh, that's so much worse. I'd rather deal with light that burns the sky. At least that's a one-time deal. Tauros' mega spammable Body Slam was also much more powerful than its initial power would suggest, thanks to its infamous crit rate, meaning that around 21.5% of the time, it was doing double damage, as crits didn't start becoming a 50% damage increase until Gen 6. The only way to avoid paralysis from Body Slam was to use a normal type, as they were not affected by the secondary effects of moves of their own type in Gen 1. Even Electrics could be paralyzed in the first 5 gens. But wait, you say, what about Gengar? That's completely immune to Body Slam, meaning you can't crit or paralyze it, and for that matter, what about Rhydon? Sure, it won't love the paralysis, but it's a slow Pokemon anyway, and its huge physical bulk means you could crit it with Body Slam repeatedly and not break it. And what about those other normal resists? Oh, that's it? Still, these are good Pokemon. What's the deal here? Yes, it's true these are good Pokemon, and they do take less than standard damage from normal. However, this brings us to another reason why Body Slam is so spammable. Not only do very few Pokemon resist it, but the 2 Pokemon that do resist it, which don't exactly fit on every team by the way, aren't actually good answers to the Body Slam users, in the same way that even though Gliscor is immune to Earthquake and Heatran is quad resistant to Ice, neither of them counter Mamoswine. Both Gengar and Rhydon are smacked by Earthquake, especially Gengar, while Rhydon gets absolutely decked by Tauros' Blizzard, and Rhydon does actually hate being paralyzed, since in addition to the risk of full paralysis on a crucial turn, it makes it slower than Snorlax and paralyzed Pokemon like Chansey and Psychics. Plus, they don't exactly threaten Tauros immediately in return. Rhydon's Stab Earthquake is one of the strongest attacks in the game, yet it only musters a 3-hit KO against Tauros. For such an offensive Pokemon, it also leverages Normal's neutrality to everything towards some impressively bulky ends. Even Gengar's Explosion, which is of course very high risk, maxes out at 64.5%. Heck, even hitting Tauros on its weaker special side struggles to do the trick. Even the massively powerful Zapdos, Thunderbolt, and Alakazam Psychic, which are equally strong, almost never muster the 2-hit KO threshold without assistance from luck, as they have a mere 0.8% chance to 2-hit KO a healthy bull, not even a full percent. The endlessly spammable Body Slam is just the grisly tip of the Gen 1 Blizzard Berg 2, where the Specs Meteor, or to be more accurate, Choice Band Outrage comparisons really start to appear, is in one of the most terrifying Gen 1 isms of all, Hyper Beam. This is the only generation where if Hyper Beam KOs an opponent, it doesn't recharge. Its massive power, which is rare for the generation, provides one of the few ways to burst through everything's maxed out bulk, at great risk of course, even riskier than something like Draco Meteor, but with enormous reward. Of course this can be played around, but if you try to catch a Hyper Beam with something not KO'd by it, and then you get Body Slammed on the switch, then you're in trouble, or Tauros might just crit you anyway. Hyper Beam's mere presence accentuated the difficulty of switching into Body Slam. You didn't just have to be able to take 2 of them. You had to be able to take Body Slam and its follow-up move that was almost twice as powerful. This was, of course, a tall task, and the damage spread throughout a battle meant Pokemon tended to very quickly find themselves on the highway to Slam Beam danger zone. Hyper Beam was such a force, even non-normal Pokemon used it, and that wasn't even all. The true apex of normal-type power was also the apex of power in Gen 1. Flat out. Snorlax's self-destruct, which came at the ultimate cost of losing Snorlax, but also actually threatened the rare game-breaking effect of 1-hit KO, since it was the only boom user to have Stab, and remember, this was an early generation boom, which had effectively doubled power through the halving of opponents' defense. Good luck taking Snorlax down before it can boom, with its titanic bulk and no weaknesses. Oh sure, it's nominally weak to fighting, just like Tauros and Chansey are, but this means nothing in practice. The normals love the presence of Psychics even more, because they render the fighters completely ineffectual to the point of non-existence. Of course, it helps that even the best of the fighters, Machamp, relies on the absolutely terrible submission for fighting stat. This means that Snorlax has the easiest time ever wailing on the opponent with its normal stabs. Stabs plural, not just because it has the option to use several, in the same way that Gen 2 Raikou might choose between Thunder and Thunderbolt, but in the way that it can use multiple normal stabs on the same set. Multiple stabs of one type on the same set is far from unheard of, but it's generally reserved for Pokemon with amazing offensive types, like Latios using Draco Meteor and Dragon Pulse, and Keldeo using Hydro Pump and Surf or Scald. You generally wouldn't imagine normal as such a type, but indeed it made certain of the phenomenon's presence in every game by virtue of the Body Slam Hyper Beam duel that always featured in Tauros Tauros' moveset, allowing for the legendary Slam Slam Beam setup in the Tauros War, while Snorlax has the option of mixing and matching which of the Hyper Beam and Self-Destruct it wants to use. That is, when it's not using all three. That's right, triple normal stab, where the solution to most problems is to simply have the right normal move. So you better make sure you have all of them at your disposal, normal maxing all the way to the bank. Offensively and defensively, the normals have it all. Even in Ubers, the realm of Mewtwo, normals were still incredibly important. After all, Gen 1 Mewtwo is the original Uber, the apex of psychic brokenness and all that jazz, but it was still a psychic, meaning that normals were crucial in the fight against it. What was the best answer to Mewtwo? A normal type, Light Screen Chansey. What was able to actually threaten damage on a paralyzed Mewtwo more reliably than anything else? Snorlax. What was still impossible to switch into safely? Tauros. Plus, if we go beyond the major Gen 1 trio, we see other solid normal types. Persian was like a second, even faster Tauros. Kangaskhan was Tauros-esque in its own way. Dodrio acted as a sort of cross between Tauros and Zapdos with Snorlax level power, and even Clefable had the slightest of niches. Clefable using Stab, Body Slam, and OU. That's the power of normals for you. These Pokemon were all great in UU, forming that tier similar dynamic centered around normal type power, but the fact that they could do it in OU as well was testament to the type's power. Now let's keep these concepts in mind as we move forward. Normal offense is incredibly spammable, almost uniquely so, only really matched by Psychic, and is also unique in having the most high-powered moves in the game. These moves come at a great risk, but are incredibly important for how game-breaking they are. Furthermore, normal is useful defensively because everything is bulky with maxed out EVs across the board, and you can't even hit it super effectively. Its sole weakness to fighting being non-existent in actual play. As a result, normals are going to be taking some seriously powerful neutral hits. In many cases, it will be more useful to use a normal type to take a hit neutrally than to use a resist. Now in Gen 2, normals, like Psychics, are not as out-and-out dominant. The addition of Steel types was a major blow to the freewheeling spam ability of the previous generation's Body Slams, and what's more, Slam could no longer be followed up by Hyper Beam, as Hyper Beam had been nerfed to always recharge, even if it KO'd an opponent. As if that wasn't bad enough, crit mechanics went from being based on speed to a flat 6.25%. Tauros went from Raging Bull to, well, the end of Raging Bull. Just like the washed-up Jake LaMotta has nothing left to fight except the walls of his prison cell, Tauros was locked up in BL, not even getting the beat up on UU as compensation. Finally, you can even hit normal super effectively now, as Champ had been given Cross Chop. However, as a whole, normal type offense and defense is still incredibly potent, and this comes from Snorlax, this generation's mandatory Pokemon, with a serious argument for being the best even in Ubers. And again, it was so good in large part because it was normal. It loved the special stat splitting in two, and gaining a massive special defense stat. This meant it was capable of leveraging its neutrality to every special attack to withstand even the mighty Zapdos' thunder. Offensively, it was still a nightmare, especially since it now boosted with Curse, but it also excelled in simply spamming damage, Gen 1 style. Earthquake still hit every normal resist that wasn't Skarmory for good damage, while Skarmory had to fear Snorlax's Fire Blast, Flamethrower, or Thunder, or in some situations, even resisted Belly Drum boosted Body Slams. If it wasn't spreading paralysis with Body Slam, it was spamming the newly buffed Pokemon of Double Edge, which was now passively healed off with leftovers. But you could at least hit Snorlax super effectively, right? Yeah, have fun actually switching Machamp directly into Snorlax and getting corked by its normal stab. Nothing else threatened Snorlax for significant damage. Well, except your own Snorlax with Self-Destruct, which had also received the power boost this gen. Once again, Snorlax was one of the better answers to opposing Snorlax depending on the moveset. Curse Rest Talk was the safest, but Self-Destruct and another new tool, Lovely Kiss, was also helpful. Essentially though, you couldn't reliably out-offense Snorlax, so you had to wall it, and walling it was also one of the most difficult challenges in the tier, given that it could sculpt its moveset to beat everything. And once again, Snorlax wasn't the only normal type. It was the best by far, but Chansey's evolution, Blissey, took special walling to truly unreal levels, again, because it was neutral to everything. There were other options too. Belly Drum Clefable was genuinely decent because its soft boil let it more reliably heal off the self-inflicted drum damage, and because its neutrality to attacks in conjunction with its bulk let it set up and heal to begin with. While Cursed Kangaskhan had a niche because it also had Roar to let it defeat Cursed Skarmory, since in Gen 2 the slower phaser wins. Going beyond OU, normal offense and defense was crucial in Ubers, as mentioned before, since Snorlax was just completely unstoppable even with no holds barred. While in UU, the long-time reign of Nidoqueen was eventually eclipsed by the new top bull, Grand Bull, which tended to play incredibly similar to a sort of UU Snorlax, except Grand Bull was actually stronger than Snorlax with an excellent base 120 attack as opposed to Snorlax's base 110. Speaking of base 110, UU also featured Dodrio's mighty Drillpex, now bolstered by the aforementioned buff Double Edge and most amazingly of all, featured occasional sweeps by Cursed Chansey. That's right, physical sweeper Chansey. That is how good normal types were. Now, Gen 3 really kicked normal types down a few pegs, and yet they were still major forces. However, let's look at those premises that normal excellence operates on. Spammability of its offense, it's still there for sure, as Snorlax can be quite a pain. However, it wasn't nearly as easy as it had been in Gen 2. More amazing normal resists kept popping up in Jirachi and Metagross, while a previous normal resist, Gengar, got a major buff with the introduction of its abilities, as it got Levitate, meaning it no longer feared Earthquake. If Snorlax wanted to hit it hard, it'd have to include Shadow Ball. Celebi didn't resist normal, but it was now allowed in OU, and it was a great Snorlax check. Between Titanic Physical Bulk, Leech Seed, and even Natural Cure to shrug off Body Slam paralysis. Snorlax also lost Lovely Kiss in the generational shift, which was a shame. On the bright side, Magnapult Magneton offered instantaneous Skarmory removal, but that took up a valuable team slot. Now the other side of the coin. Huge Bulk allowing the withstanding of opposing attacks, which are nearly all neutral. Now there we have some problems. First of all, EVs are no longer maxed out across the board. Gen 3 introduced the 508 limit that we have to this day, meaning you can, at best, max out 2 stats with their individual cap of 252 apiece. Gen 3 also introduced Natures, which takes a boosted stat to higher levels than possible before. This means that generally, attacks are hitting much harder. While this is good news in that it makes Snorlax's own attack stronger, it is bad news that Snorlax's own hit-taking ability takes a hit itself. And Snorlax depends on exactly that, given its non-existent speed. It's still a bulky Pokemon, of course, and its new ability, Immunity, lets it pivot into Toxic now, as it was generally a better choice than the alternative Thick Fat, which was useful, but Fire and Ice moves were generally not sufficiently threatening to warrant it. Nice though gaining 2 resists would be. However, in choosing how to EV itself, Snorlax has to make some serious concessions beyond just its moveset now. This issue is exacerbated by another ability, the one that shapes the entire metagame, Tyranitar Sandstream, whose omnipresence means without some serious team help or a lucky matchup, Snorlax is no longer shrugging hits off with leftovers passive healing as it did in Gen 2. Oh, and it goes even further. Fighting moves are much more common now, even on non-fighting Pokemon, with the introduction of Brick Break and Focus Punch. Brick Break is lower power and Focus Punch isn't an easy move to use, so it's not like Snorlax is suddenly easy to take down, but it is easier. This is also reflected in the general high level of power present now, with new high base power moves like Metagross, Meteor Mash, and new boosting options in Choice Band, Dragon Dance, and Calm Mind, the latter meaning that even Snorlax's impressive special defense can be overwhelmed. The higher level of power meant something else as well. Previously, normal had been unique in how its offense was among the best in the game. Now it was becoming easier and easier to mount a massive offensive onslaught without relying on normal offense, which would have been genuinely impossible previously, or at the very least stab normal offense, as non-stab explosions were very popular. Now Blissey actually improved in the generational shift, with the splitting of EVs and faster general pace, with the nerf of Sleep Talk no longer being able to call rest in conjunction with increased passive damage in sand and multi-layered spikes, meant that Blissey could actually pose a threat and not just be a passive walling blob. Previously, its extreme special walling tended towards overkill, as Lax also took the special hits wonderfully and was the greatest offensive threat in the tier, meaning you only use Blissey on stall teams that wanted to support Snorlax with Heal Bell, or perhaps Light Screen to better enable Belly Drum in the face of legendary Electric Thunders. Now though, with the major increase in pace and power, Blissey's extra survivability, owing both to its bulk and its instant healing is soft-boiled, and even the status heal of Natural Cure was imperative. Both Blissey and Snorlax were still major forces in Gen 3 OU, 2 of its most defining powerful figures, but the signs of the normal type decline were beginning to show. Still, normal was far from a lesser type, as one of the most dangerous physical attacks in the tier, while not stab, was a normal move. Against a neutral target like a Suicune, Choice Band Aerodactyl's strongest move was Double Edge, out-damaging even its stab Rock Slide, and not having to deal with recoil thanks to its Rockhead ability. It wasn't just Double Edge's power making it one of the best physical attacks too, it was the neutral coverage. This was still crucial back then, as despite the increases in strength, the power level was not at the outrageous level that it would soon become. Double Edge was also seen as a tool on Dragon Dance Gyarados. Incidentally, this is why certain Choice Band normal types had niches in OU. The best was Slack King, in spite of its risk of Truant, because it had stunning power and decent physical bulk alongside the base 100 speed benchmark, and there was also Tauros with its great speed and new Intimidate ability, and Dojiro with its Snorlax level attack, stab drill peck for Celebi, and a pseudo U-turn in Baton Pass. Normals were still part of the landscape in Gen 3 because of their normal typing, even if that didn't quite mean what it had before. But it was when Gen 4 rolled around that the landscape became increasingly hostile to normals at every corner. This was where the shift began. If a normal type was to succeed, it was in spite of being a normal type now, not because of it. This was where normal types started being seen more and more as a lower tier Pokemon because they were normal. In the power-crept world of Gen 4 and onwards, normal's neutrality was no longer enough. Yes, defensively, it could still work, but you had to take things to an extreme. This meant Blissey, of course, which was still impressively tanky, but whereas in Gen 3 it had even been quite solid at taking physical attacks, now it had to be careful of even special attacks like Gengar's Life Orb Focus Blast and Heatran Specs Overheat. A more defined palette of resist would have been incredible for it. The same applied to the late metagame takeover of Clefable, which wielded the unbelievable power of Magic Guard in spite of its complete lack of resist. Part of why players were so hesitant to accept the power of Clefable was because it didn't feel as bulky as it needed to be in order to take on things like Zapdos without any resist to help it. Turns out it's just bulky enough when Magic Guard is keeping you at full health constantly, and it can take things like 2 Heatran Fire Blasts just fine with good play. Heck, it can survive 2 Specs Latios Draco Meteor, but when under pressure from something like Specs Kingdra Hydro Pump or Nasty Plot Celebi Leaf Storm that Blissey would laugh at, you really find yourself wishing that Clefable's typing could do more than just pivot itself into Shadow Ball. A useful trait and nonetheless trade something more general. Offensively though, Normal was dead as a doornail. At least Stab Normal was, as Explosion was incredibly common and useful on a variety of non-normal Pokemon, while Lucario and Dragonite's extreme speeds were superb tools as well. But the days of Stab, Body Slam, and Double Edge were gone, and it had never been easier to resist Normal and threaten it back in return, especially come Platinum, with the Rotom Appliance and a Bullet Punch superpower packing Scizor bursting onto the scene. Snorlax had been decent in Diamond and Pearl, albeit living in the shadow of monsters like Garchomp and Infernape, but now it began its slow crawl towards obscurity. Unfortunately, too slow for it to actually hit UU. It seemed like it could do something just well enough to keep its usage in OU, though its actual impact on the tier was minimal to nil. It wasn't just that normal offense was now easy to stifle. Remember when normal had been unique for its powerful offensive options? Well, now everything had powerful offensive options. The physical special split enabled Breloom, newly gained Grass Stab, to the full extent of its fighting spamming menace. It also turned Waterfall Gyarados into one of the most frightening Pokemon in the game, and it let physical dragons use their stab on boosting sets. Speaking of which, Outrage was buffed to the 120 base power monster that we know of today, as opposed to the 90 it had started out with. Beyond the split, the new power options were huge and left normal stab in the shadows. In addition to many of the aforementioned options, close combat didn't just make it easier than ever to one-hit KO the normals without breaking a sweat. It also threatened pretty much the entire metagame. It packed Double Edge's power with no recoil and with infinitely better coverage. The early idea of normal type power being high risk and high reward was now completely obsolete. Now, for much less risk, you could reap much higher rewards. If you weren't Extreme Killer Arceus level scary, you weren't doing stab normal offense in OU, which is why the best normal type super was actually Swords Dance Lucario. You could go to UU and do just fine. There you could use the excellent familiar phases in Kangaskhan and Tauros. You could unleash Swellow's hyper fast, hyper powerful stab facade since it could now status itself with an orb, and you could even use Life Orb Double Edge Clefable without incurring any recoil thanks to Magic Guard. In OU though, forget it, and this trend only increased in the following generations. Even the mighty Blissey, now flanked by Eviolite bearing Chansey, struggled to keep up with the fighting, dragon, and weather-heavy onslaught of Gen 5 OU offense, relegated only to certain stall teams. Clefable eventually proved Magic Guard to be a truly insane ability when it established a niche for itself in Gen 5 in spite of its lack of resist, but even there, it was a specialized choice, and had to hope it wouldn't run into too high-powered an offense team that it would crumple before. At least Snorlax was one of the very best Pokemon in UU, and for a long time was considered the best full stop, and it did that in a tier overflowing with fighting types to boot. However, OU was proving to be too much. Even Blissey fell out of the tier in Gen 6, with Chansey needing Eviolite's added bulk to leverage that neutrality and bulk against the threats it was facing now, which of course came at the major cost of not having leftovers, meaning even just double switching on it to rack up Stealth Rock damage was majorly impactful in a way you couldn't really do to Blissey. Meanwhile, Clefable was now king because it was no longer a normal type. It went from being frightened of fighting types to countering them and dragons, and even resisting Tyranitar's Choice Band Crunch and Pursuit. Now, normal Normal did make a few last gaps to reclaim its former greatness in Gen 6. The first was Mega Kangaskhan, which was, let's say, a bit of an overcorrection, as it was now banned from OU, and with the quickness. The second was Mega Audino, which was an abject failure, easily the worst Mega. The third, and most interesting, was Boom Burst. This was theoretically exactly what normal offense needed. Stunning 140 base power on par with pre-Gen 6 Dracometer, but with zero drawbacks. Plus, unlike most normal moves, it was a special attack that didn't make contact, so forget punishing it with Rocky Helmet or weakening it through Intimidate. This is exactly the kind of spam ability necessary for normal to succeed offensively, as it's got the kind of power to slash through even many resists. Choice specs normal types previously non-existent now brim with possibility. The question is, what's going to use it? X-Cloud? Yeah, never mind. You'd have to have something enabling to get on the field to spam the move, and X-Cloud, for all its power, was otherwise a very bland normal type. Low defenses betraying high HP alongside sub-average speed, with its type of course not exactly offering it anything in terms of entry points either. Swellow would make use of Boom Burst nicely in Gen 7 RU with huge speed and the ghost-busting scrappy ability, but the overall idea that normal offense was for the lower tiers was still there. Boom Burst's most effective use in OU was on a Specs Toxtricity set in Gen 8's Isle of Armor metagame, as Toxtricity's Punk Rock ability pushed Boom Burst to stunning levels of power and actually made it its strongest move overall, akin to Gen 3's Aerodactyl's Double Edge. So once again, normal offense was done better by a non-normal type. And speaking of, Game Freak's final push to revive normal in Gen 6 was to introduce the Pixelate and Aerolite abilities, which powered up normal moves and turned them into another type. The best way to unleash normal type power is to make it not normal anymore? Yeah, that sounds about right. Here's how far normals have fallen. We've made a video exploring how broken the Ghost type has become in the wake of the Steel nerf, especially with the Pursuit removal that followed. It's become immensely difficult to resist Ghost now, Dark types being your only real option. Why aren't normal types being used for this task? With how busted Ghosts have become in Gens 8 and 9, you would think they'd make some sort of comeback. After all, they do better than just resist, they're immune. Yes, but then you're stuck with all the downsides of using a normal type, and that winds up effectively being its own advantage for the user of the Ghost. Pokemon players will literally rather get bombarded by broken Ghosts than go to therapy, use a normal type. How did the normal type fall this far when it once occupied such towering heights? Now you might be thinking, surely VGC being an entirely different metagame tells a different story, right? The answer to that question is, kind of. Throughout VGC's several rotating formats, there have been instances of normal type Pokemon dominating metagames. Snorlax won in 2008 along with Smeargle, a Pokemon so incredibly broken that we have a 31-minute video on it. Snorlax then proceeded to win in 2009. The normal type then disappeared from the map until 2015, where Mega Kangaskhan not only won, but was so dominant it was present in 6 out of the top 8 teams at Worlds. After Mega Kangaskhan's reign of terror came 2016, a year so fundamentally marked by Smeargle's Dark Void shenanigans that the move was nerfed into oblivion, along with Kangaskhan's parental bond ability. Snorlax came back in 2018 like Mike Tyson ready for one more shot at the ring, and much like Tyson did, Snorlax secured the bag, taking home the championship. The question is, was the success of these Pokemon correlated to the normal type? And for us, it most certainly was not. Kangaskhan and Smeargle's success is attributed to their incomparable ability to support the rest of the team through their unique characteristics, such as an unlimited move pool or parental bond's power of family. Snorlax, its access to a pre-nerf stab self-destruct, and the item change rule definitely helped in 2008 and 2009, and the raw destructive power of Belly Drum Lax with 50% berries helped it secure the win. Snorlax's VGC history is a right place, right time sort of deal. Now, it can definitely be said that these Pokemon succeeded in spite of their normal type and not because of it. Nowadays, the normal type shines through Farigiraf and both of the Ursalunas, who are solid staples in the metagame, but serve a supporting role much more than being the star of the show like Snorlax, Smeargle, and Kangaskhan once were. So basically, these outliers were good because you could throw their special traits onto any Pokemon, and they would succeed regardless of their type. Normal type's neutrality used to be their great strength, letting their unique advantages shine through. But as the game has gotten stronger and stronger, those advantages have been sanded down until they can barely be said to exist at all. Now you need the major advantages of other types, even though they come with weaknesses. To simply remain impartial, just like the normal type, is just not acceptable anymore.
What are your thoughts on this momentous occasion? Your neutralness?
I have no strong feelings one way or the other.
And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel is Beast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.